Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine family scheme. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here.
In a startling political upheaval, Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself engulfed in controversy after his outspoken condemnation of a crucial court ruling. The incident unfolded during an intense parliamentary session on February 12, where Starmer, responding to a query about a judicial verdict concerning a Gaza refugee family, issued a statement that many viewed as not only audacious, but also reckless. With unwavering confidence, he dismissed the ruling as wrong, asserting that immigration laws should be dictated solely by Parliament, not the courts. His remarks, delivered with characteristic self-assurance, sent ripples through both legal and political circles, setting off a firestorm of criticism. This was far more than a simple disagreement, it was a direct affront to the judiciary's authority. Given his background as a human rights lawyer and former director of public prosecutions, Starmer was expected to be a steadfast defender of the rule of law. Instead, he appeared to undermine it, portraying the judiciary as an overreaching body that created legal loopholes rather than enforcing existing statutes. However, the reality was quite different. The court had merely applied human rights laws that Parliament itself had enacted. The irony was glaring. A man who had built his career on legal expertise was now publicly challenging the very system he once vowed to uphold. His remarks did more than provoke political discourse. They triggered a constitutional crisis, casting a spotlight on the fragility of the separation of powers and the risks of a leader willing to compromise judicial independence for political leverage.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government.
The judicial response was swift and uncompromising. Lady Chief Justice Baroness Carr, the highest-ranking judge in England and Wales, took the rare and extraordinary step of publicly censuring the Prime Minister, an occurrence almost unprecedented in modern British history. Traditionally, judges maintain a stance of neutrality, steering clear of political confrontations to uphold the integrity of the court. However, Starmer's remarks had crossed a threshold so serious that remaining silent was no longer an option. In an unprecedented move, Baroness Carr broke tradition, using a formal press conference to denounce a sitting Prime Minister, branding his statements as unacceptable and a direct challenge to judicial independence. Her reaction was not limited to words. She took decisive action, formally addressing a letter to Starmer and the Lord Chancellor, warning that his rhetoric posed a fundamental threat to Britain's democratic framework. The gravity of this moment cannot be overstated. For a Chief Justice to openly confront the head of government signals an impending constitutional crisis. Starmer's statements were not merely a passing political remark, they signified a deeper erosion of the separation of powers, setting a dangerous precedent that could invite further encroachments on judicial authority. Baroness Carr's intervention stood as a rare but resolute defense against an encroaching disregard for democratic norms, a stark reminder that no leader, no matter how powerful, is above the law. In challenging the Prime Minister's words, she was not merely defending one legal decision, she was standing as a guardian of Britain's judicial integrity and democratic principles.
But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
The repercussions of Starmer's attack on the judiciary were both swift and profound. What was likely meant to project strength and control quickly unraveled into a full-scale public relations disaster, exposing deep vulnerabilities in his leadership and casting doubt on his dedication to democratic principles. Legal analysts, opposition figures, and even members of his own party criticized his remarks, warning that politicizing judicial independence for short-term gain was a reckless and dangerous path. His distortion of the court ruling, framing it as an instance of judicial overreach rather than the legitimate enforcement of established human rights law, only worsened the situation. His rhetoric aligned disturbingly well with populist narratives that seek to discredit the judiciary, portraying judges not as impartial defenders of justice, but as unelected elites obstructing the will of the people. Beyond the immediate backlash, this episode left a lasting stain on Starmer's credibility. A leader who had meticulously built his image around legal expertise and a deep respect for the rule of law suddenly found himself accused of undermining the very system he once championed. Critics were quick to highlight the irony. A former human rights lawyer, once seen as a defender of judicial independence, now attacking a court ruling simply because it was politically inconvenient. In an era of eroding public trust in politicians, Starmer's actions sent a dangerous signal that even a prime minister with a legal background was willing to disregard democratic norms for political expediency. In his bid to project authority, he instead exposed a troubling short-sightedness.
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
The impact of Starmer's reckless remarks stretched far beyond the political arena, thrusting the judiciary into an escalating crisis of both security and credibility. By publicly condemning a judge's ruling as wrong and insinuating that courts were encroaching on parliamentary authority, he amplified a dangerous narrative, one that recast judges not as neutral enforcers of the law, but as political adversaries. The fallout was immediate and deeply troubling. Reports surfaced of mounting hostility toward members of the judiciary, with judges subjected to an unprecedented surge of online abuse, harassment, and even explicit threats. Baroness Carr herself issued a stark warning, revealing that judicial figures across Britain were increasingly fearful for their safety, with some now facing real and growing dangers. These threats were not merely hypothetical. In a disturbing real-world incident, a judge was violently attacked in his own courtroom, struck with a radiator by an enraged defendant, an alarming testament to the rising risks faced by those upholding the law. The deteriorating security situation forced officials to explore extreme measures, including the possibility of establishing a dedicated judicial protection force, akin to those in countries like Canada. This unsettling reality laid bare the true consequences of Starmer's rhetoric. When political leaders undermine trust in the judiciary, they embolden those willing to challenge the rule of law through coercion and violence. His words were not just a strategic misstep, they were an irresponsible gamble that endangered the very fabric of British democracy and put the personal safety of judges at risk.
They put the complete opposite argument. She talks about on top of her breath. She has no idea what she's talking about. I'll tell her again. We need to change the law. That's why the Home Secretary is already closing the gap. I know the script doesn't allow any adaptation, but this is getting tedious.
Starmer's assault on the judiciary was not an isolated misstep. It was a symptom of a broader pattern that underscored the growing gap between his rhetoric and his actions. During his campaign, he positioned himself as a principled leader, vowing to restore trust in British institutions, defend the rule of law, and govern with integrity. However, once in power, his actions painted a starkly different picture. His readiness to publicly challenge judicial independence was just one instance of a recurring trend, prioritizing political convenience over consistency, even at the expense of his own stated values. This inconsistency was not limited to the courts. On immigration, he pledged to establish a fair and balanced system, yet his stance increasingly aligned with hardline conservative rhetoric. On economic matters, he promised to champion the interests of working families, yet his administration funneled resources into military expansion and global positioning, while everyday Britons struggled with the cost of living. This contradiction was most glaring in his foreign policy. Observers accused him of crafting diplomatic stances based on international optics, rather than concrete benefits for British citizens. His handling of crises like Ukraine and Gaza appeared more calculated for political image than rooted in sincere conviction. Meanwhile, confidence in his leadership waned. Public opinion polls reflected a growing sense of disillusionment as voters began to recognize the widening gulf between Starmer's pledges and his actual governance. His attack on the judiciary was not just a singular error, it became emblematic of a deeper failure, exposing a leader more preoccupied with appearance than with upholding the very principles he once championed. See you next time.